For years, I've been the one taking care of my dad, but now he's planning to live with my brother, who hasn't been much help, just because he has more space. I feel deeply hurt and blindsided, and I don't know how to deal with it. For the past 6 years, I've been the main caregiver for my dad. It wasn't easy or glamorous, but I did it out of love for him. Now, it feels like none of it meant anything. My dad is 78, and his health started seriously declining about 7 years ago. He's had heart issues, arthritis, early signs of dementia, the whole range of problems. At that time, my brother Nick and I talked about how we would handle Dad's care. I offered to take charge, while Nick, who had just gotten married and started his own family, said he'd help when he could. Spoiler alert, he didn't help much. At first, I thought I could balance everything, my job, social life, and taking care of Dad. But as his condition worsened, it became a full-time job. I cooked his meals, took him to appointments, managed his medications, cleaned the house, and even helped him with bathing and dressing. On the toughest days, my entire life revolved around him. I had to cut back at work, which hurt financially, and I stopped dating because I simply didn't have the time. Meanwhile, Nick would visit once a month for an hour or two, bringing his kids along, and then leave me to clean up the mess they left behind. He'd occasionally call Dad, but those calls usually turned into lectures on how I should be doing more, like taking Dad on walks or feeding him healthier meals. Typical armchair quarterback behavior. To be clear, I didn't resent taking care of Dad. I did it because he's my father and it felt like my duty. But the lack of support from Nick stung. Still, I tried not to focus on it too much. I figured Dad appreciated everything I was doing, and that was what mattered in the end. Fast forward to last week, Dad sat me down for a serious talk. I thought maybe he wanted to discuss his health or his will. Instead, he told me that he had been thinking and decided to move in with Nick and his family. He said it like he'd just won the lottery. They have more space, and I think it'll be good for me to be around the kids more, he explained. I was shocked. My heart sank, and I could hardly find the words to respond. But I've been taking care of you all this time. Why now? Did I do something wrong? I asked. No, of course not, he quickly replied. You've been wonderful, sweetheart, but Nick's house has a big yard, and the kids keep me young. Plus, I don't want to keep burdening you. I felt like I'd been slapped. After 6 years of giving up my time, money, and mental health, he thought he was burdening me? And don't even get me started on the more space excuse. Nick has a 3-bedroom house, while I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. Sure, I gave Dad the bigger room, but I made it work. Still, I swallowed my pride and tried to keep it civil. Okay, if that's what you really want. But have you thought about how this will actually work? Nick barely helps as it is. Will he really take on your care? Dad smiled, as if he hadn't even thought about it. Oh, I'm sure they'll figure it out. Nick says he's looking into hiring someone to help with the heavy stuff. Hire someone? So now Nick gets to come in, play the hero, and outsource the hard work I've been doing for free. The unfairness of it all hit me like a freight train. But it got worse. A few days later, Nick called to talk logistics. I was already on edge, but answered, thinking maybe he wanted to thank me or reassure me that Dad's care would be handled well. Instead, he dropped another bomb. So, Dad and I were talking about the inheritance, Nick said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. He's thinking it makes the most sense to leave everything to me, since I'll be living here, you know, to help with the expenses of taking care of him. I was speechless. Excuse me? You mean the house, the savings, everything, all to you? I asked. Yeah, Nick replied, his tone annoyingly matter-of-fact. I mean, you've been doing a lot for Dad, but I have a family to support, and we'll need to make some adjustments to have him here. It just seems practical. Practical? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd spent years caring for Dad, putting my own needs on the back burner. And now Nick gets the inheritance and the glory of being the good son who took Dad in. I told Nick I needed time to process this, hung up, and immediately broke down in tears. Since then, I can't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Am I crazy for feeling betrayed? Is it wrong to expect some recognition, or at least fairness for everything I've done? Right now, I feel like I'm at a crossroads. Part of me wants to confront Dad and Nick and demand they acknowledge how unfair this is, but another part wonders if I should just let it go and move on with my life. Maybe this is a chance to finally regain my freedom. Still, the thought of Nick getting the house, the savings, and all the credit for taking care of Dad makes my blood boil. Let's be real. How long is Nick going to last before he realizes caregiving isn't just about cute grandkid visits and yard games? What do you think? Should I fight this or walk away? Am I being unreasonable for wanting some recognition for everything I've done? I decided I couldn't just stay quiet and let this happen without saying something. After a couple of days of thinking it over, I invited Dad and Nick to my place for a family talk. Let me tell you, I was nervous as hell. I didn't want to come off as ungrateful or bitter, but I knew I had to stand up for myself. I rehearsed what I was going to say 100 times in my head before they arrived. When they showed up, Nick was his usual self, smug and annoyingly cheerful, while Dad seemed uncomfortable, like he knew this wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. I started by calmly laying everything out. I want to talk about your decision to move in with Nick, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I understand why you think it might be a good idea, but I need to be honest about how this feels from my perspective. Nick immediately jumped in. Look, I know you're upset, but this is what Dad wants. It's not personal. Not personal. That was rich coming from the guy who had barely lifted a finger for Dad over the past 6 years. I ignored him and turned to Dad. I've been taking care of you for so long, and I don't regret it. But it's hard not to feel like all of that's being brushed aside. You're moving out, which is your choice. But then there's the inheritance. Nick told me you're planning to leave everything to him. Is that true? Dad looked at me with those sad eyes that used to make me feel guilty. But not this time. Sweetheart, it's not that I don't appreciate everything you've done. You've been amazing. But Nick has a family, and they'll need the money more than you will. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So because I don't have kids, my sacrifices don't matter? Do you realize how much I've given up to take care of you? Nick rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. No one forced you to do it. You chose to take care of Dad. That was it. The dam broke. Are you kidding me, Nick? You said you'd help, and then you disappeared. You did the bare minimum, and now you're swooping in to play the hero. And Dad, you're rewarding him for it. Do you really think he's going to step up now? Or are you okay with him hiring someone to do the work I've been doing for free? Dad looked conflicted, but Nick was unfazed. This isn't about who did what. It's about what's best for Dad going forward. I couldn't take it anymore. No, Nick, it's about you getting a house and money you didn't earn. And Dad, I need to know, do you honestly think this is fair? Because it doesn't feel fair to me. The room went quiet for a few moments. Dad looked down at his hands, avoiding my gaze. Nick shifted uncomfortably, probably because he wasn't expecting me to push back this hard. Finally, Dad sighed. I didn't mean to hurt you. Maybe I didn't think this through as much as I should have. I thought that might be my chance to get through to him, but Nick jumped in again, his tone suddenly defensive. You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be. If it's about money, we can figure something out. But this is happening. Okay, Dad's moving in with us, and that's final. I wanted to scream, but instead, I took a deep breath and said, Fine. Do what you want. But don't come crying to me when you realize how hard caregiving actually is. With that, I stood up and left the room. I couldn't sit there and listen to Nick's condescension or Dad's excuses any longer. Since that conversation, things have been tense. Dad moved in with Nick last weekend, and it's already been a mess. The day after the move, Nick called me to ask a bunch of questions about Dad's medication schedule and dietary needs, questions he should have asked months ago if he was serious about taking on this responsibility. To make matters worse, Dad already seems unhappy. 2 nights ago, he called me to complain about how hectic Nick's house is. Apparently, the grandkids are overwhelming for him, and he's not getting the peace and quiet he was hoping for. Not exactly a surprise, right? Meanwhile, I'm left trying to figure out where I go from here. Part of me thinks I should just wash my hands of the whole situation and let Nick deal with it. But then there's Dad, who I still care about, even though I'm hurt by his choices. Here's where things take an even stranger turn. Yesterday, I got a call from my aunt, Dad's sister. She'd heard about the move and was furious. Apparently, years ago, Dad promised her that the family home would be shared equally between Nick and me, as it had been passed down through generations. Aunt Laura doesn't let things slide, and she told me she's planning to confront Dad about it. On one hand, I'm relieved someone else sees how unfair this is, but on the other hand, I'm worried this will just lead to more family drama. Nick already thinks I'm being selfish, and if Aunt Laura gets involved, I'm sure he'll accuse me of bringing her into it, even though she called me. I feel stuck in the middle of a mess I didn't create, and I have no idea what's going to happen next. Part of me wonders if this is karma catching up with Nick, but I don't want Dad to suffer because of it. What should I do? Should I let Aunt Laura handle this? Or should I try to smooth things over before it gets worse? I'm exhausted from fighting, but I also don't want to let Nick walk all over me. So, things escalated big time. I wasn't sure if Aunt Laura would actually follow through on confronting Dad, but she definitely did. And then some. She called me yesterday to tell me she was hosting a family meeting at her house, and that I absolutely had to be there. According to her, this wasn't just unfair to me. It was a betrayal of family values. I didn't want to go at first. I was already emotionally drained, and the thought of another confrontation made me feel sick. But Aunt Laura was insistent. If you don't stand up for yourself now, they'll keep walking all over you, she said. Honestly, she had a point. So last night, I found myself sitting in Aunt Laura's living room, facing my dad, Nick, and his wife, Stacy. Aunt Laura had her husband and another one of our cousins there for moral support, or backup, depending on how you look at it. The tension was thick. Aunt Laura wasted no time. I've heard some things that don't sit right with me, she started, glaring at Dad and Nick. For years, my name has taken care of you, Dad's name, without complaint. She sacrificed her time, her career, and her personal life for you. And now you're rewarding her by handing everything over to Nick. How is that fair? Nick immediately got defensive. Look, we didn't come here to get attacked. This is about what's best for Dad. And what's best for Dad is to alienate the person who's been there for him through thick and thin, Aunt Laura fired back. I don't think so. And what's this I hear about the house? It's supposed to go to both of you, not just Nick. At this point, Dad looked incredibly uncomfortable. Laura, I didn't mean to upset anyone. I just thought this arrangement made the most sense. Aunt Laura wasn't having it. Made the most sense for who? Nick? Because it sure doesn't make sense for my name. That's when Nick finally snapped. You know what? This is ridiculous. My name chose to take care of Dad. No one forced her, and yeah, maybe she did more than I did, but I have a family to take care of. I can't just drop everything like she can. That comment hit me hard. Drop everything, I said, my voice shaking. Do you have any idea how much I dropped? My career, my social life, my future plans, all of it went on hold so I could take care of Dad. Meanwhile, you got to live your life like nothing changed, and now you're acting like I'm the selfish one. Nick rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. You act like you didn't have a choice. You could have put Dad in a care home if it was too much for you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Wow, just wow. So all the years I spent making sure Dad was comfortable, healthy, and loved, that was a choice I made out of convenience? Stacy finally tried to step in, playing peacemaker. Look, we all appreciate what you've done, my name, but at the end of the day, Dad's living with us now, and we're taking on those responsibilities. It makes sense for the inheritance to reflect that. Aunt Laura wasn't letting that slide. For the first time in the conversation, Dad spoke up. Enough, everyone. Enough, he said, raising his hand as if calling for order in a courtroom. I didn't realize how much hurt this decision was causing my name. I'm sorry. I never wanted you to feel like your sacrifices didn't matter. They did. I could feel tears welling up, but I held them back. Then why are you doing this, Dad? Why are you rewarding Nick for doing the bare minimum while I'm left with nothing? Dad sighed deeply. I guess I thought Nick needed the help more. He has a family to support, and you've always been so independent. That word, independent, made me want to scream. I've been independent because I had no choice. Dad, do you think I wanted to give up my life? I did it because I love you, but now it feels like none of that even mattered. The room went quiet. Dad looked down at his hands, ashamed. Aunt Laura was the one to break the silence. So, what are you going to do about it? Dad's name. Because I'm telling you right now, this isn't right. If you don't fix it, I'll make sure the whole family knows what's going on. After a lot of back and forth, Dad finally agreed to revisit the inheritance plans. He didn't commit to anything specific, but he did say he wanted to make things fairer. Nick, of course, was livid. He kept muttering about how this was all unnecessary drama and how I was playing the victim. Aunt Laura, bless her, wasn't having any of it. She told Nick to grow up and take responsibility for his actions. By the end of the night, Nick stormed out, dragging Stacy behind him, while Dad stayed behind to talk with me. He apologized again, saying he hadn't realized how much his decision was hurting me. I told him I wasn't trying to be greedy or ungrateful. I just wanted... He promised he'd think about everything we discussed. But honestly, I'm not holding my breath. I wish I could say I feel better. But I'm still emotionally drained. Aunt Laura has been amazing, though. She told me she's going to keep checking in with Dad to ensure he follows through on his promise. Part of me feels guilty for involving her in this mess, but another part of me knows I needed her support. As for Nick, he hasn't spoken to me since the meeting, and honestly, I'm fine with that. Let him be mad. He got called out, and he doesn't like it. That's not my problem. I'm still trying to figure out my next steps. Do I keep fighting for fairness, or do I let it go and focus on rebuilding my own life? A big part of me wants to move on, but another part feels like walking away would be letting them win. What do you think? After the family meeting, I had a lot to think about. I realized I was at a crossroads. I could keep fighting for fairness, or walk away and focus on my own life. For the first time in years, neither option felt great, but I knew I had to make a decision. Let me start with the aftermath of the family meeting. Nick stormed out, furious that Aunt Laura had called him out and that Dad was reconsidering the inheritance. Since then, Nick has been on a rampage, telling anyone who will listen that I'm manipulative and trying to take what's his. I've been getting texts and calls from mutual relatives, most of whom are confused about what's going on. A few are on Nick's side, saying I should be grateful that Dad is being cared for and that it's just money. But most people, especially those who know how much I've done for Dad, are firmly in my corner. Stacy even texted me once, saying this is causing so much stress for Nick and her. "Can't you just let it go?" she asked. I didn't bother responding. If she thinks I'm going to back down just to make their lives easier, she clearly doesn't know me. A few days after the family meeting, Dad came over to talk. He seemed more reflective this time, which gave me some hope. He started by apologizing again, saying he didn't realize how much his decision was hurting me. "I've been thinking a lot about what you and Laura said," he admitted. "I want to make things right, but I also don't want to cause more conflict." I asked him what he meant by making things right, and that's when he dropped his idea. He proposed splitting the inheritance evenly between Nick and me. On paper, it sounded fair, but when I asked how that would work with the house, he hesitated. "Well," he said, "I was thinking Nick could still get the house, but we'd sell some of the other assets to even it out." I couldn't believe it. "So Nick still gets the family home, and I get cash?" He nodded, clearly thinking this was a brilliant compromise. But to me, it felt like a slap in the face. The house has so much sentimental value. It's where we grew up, where I took care of him for years. Giving it to Nick felt like erasing all the sacrifices I made. I told him I appreciated that he was trying to be fair, but this didn't feel like a real solution. "It's not just about the money, Dad. It's about what the house represents. Do you really think Nick deserves it more than I do?" Dad didn't have an answer for that, and the conversation ended with him promising to think about it some more. I left feeling more frustrated than ever. Aunt Laura, bless her heart, wasn't about to let this go. When I told her about Dad's proposed solution, she was livid. "He's still letting Nick walk all over you," she said. "This isn't right, and he knows it." She decided to call Dad herself and give him another piece of her mind. I wasn't part of that conversation, but I know it must have been intense because the next day, Dad called me and said he wanted to revisit everything. Apparently, Aunt Laura had pointed out that if he left the house to Nick, it would cause a permanent rift in the family. She reminded him that Nick had done next to nothing for him over the years, and that rewarding him with the family home would be a slap in the face to me. For once, it seemed like Dad was starting to see reason. Last night, Dad invited me over for dinner. I was nervous, but I went, hoping this would finally be the resolution I needed. After we ate, he sat me down and said he'd made his decision. "I've thought a lot about what's fair," he began. "You've done so much for me, and I don't want you to feel like that's being ignored. So I've decided to split everything equally, house included." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. "What do you mean, house included?" I asked. "The house will be sold, and the proceeds will be split evenly between you and Nick," he explained. "It's not perfect, but it's the only way I can think of to make things fair." Part of me was relieved. This was much better than Nick getting the house outright, but another part of me was sad. I'd always dreamed of keeping the house in the family, and selling it felt like closing a chapter of our lives. Still, I knew it was the best compromise I was going to get. I asked Dad if he'd told Nick yet, and he shook his head. "I wanted to tell you first. I have no doubt Nick is going to lose his mind when he hears this, but honestly, I don't care anymore. I've spent so much of my life trying to keep the peace, and it's only ever left me feeling drained and unappreciated. If Nick wants to throw a tantrum, that's his problem. So that's where things stand now. The house will be sold, and the inheritance will be split evenly. It's not the outcome I'd hoped for, but it's fair, and I can live with that. I'm also trying to focus on myself for the first time in years. I've started reconnecting with friends, looking into new career opportunities, and even thinking about dating again. It's weird having this much free time, but it also feels like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. As for Nick, we haven't spoken since the family meeting, and I'm fine with that. If he wants to sulk, that's on him. I'm done bending over backward to make other people happy. It's been a wild ride, but I'm finally starting to feel like I can move on with my life. And honestly, that's the best inheritance I could ask for. I thought selling the house and splitting the inheritance would bring some closure, but I underestimated just how much drama Nick would stir up in the aftermath. Buckle up because this final chapter is a doozy. As expected, Nick was furious when Dad told him about the decision to sell the house. He called me almost immediately, and the conversation was explosive, to say the least. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" he spat as soon as I answered. "Dad was fine with giving me the house, but you had to drag Aunt Laura into it and turn him against me." I took a deep breath, determined to stay calm. "Nick, this isn't about turning anyone against you. It's about fairness. You can't honestly believe you deserve the house more than I do after everything I've done for Dad." He laughed bitterly. "Oh, spare me the martyr act. You're just jealous because I have a family, and you don't. Admit it." That hit a nerve, but I refused to let him see it. "You know what, Nick? I'm done arguing with you. Dad made his decision, and it's final. If you have a problem with it, take it up with him." I hung up before he could say anything else and immediately blocked his number. I knew he'd find other ways to lash out, but I wasn't going to let him take up any more of my emotional energy. A few days later, Stacy called me. I didn't recognize the number, so I answered, not expecting the ambush that followed. "Hi, it's Stacy. I just wanted to say that Nick and I are really disappointed in how you've handled all of this. You've caused so much unnecessary tension in the family." I couldn't believe my ears. "Stacy, I don't know what you think I've done wrong. All I've ever wanted is for things to be fair. If that's causing tension, maybe you should look at how Nick's been acting." She sighed dramatically, like she was the victim here. "Nick's just trying to do what's best for Dad. You're making it about yourself." That was the last straw. "You know what, Stacy? I don't need to justify myself to you. If you're so worried about Dad, maybe you should focus on helping Nick take care of him instead of calling me to complain." I hung up and blocked her number too. I was done playing nice. In the midst of all this chaos, something unexpected happened. One of my cousins, Sarah, reached out to me. She's Aunt Laura's daughter, and we've always been friendly, but not particularly close. Apparently, she'd heard about the situation from her mom and wanted to check in. "I just wanted to say, I think you're handling this really well," she said. "I know it's been a nightmare, but you're absolutely in the right." Her words meant more than I expected. For so long, I'd felt like I was standing alone in this fight, but knowing someone else saw my side was incredibly validating. Sarah went on to say that if I ever needed help dealing with Nick or just wanted to vent, she was there for me. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. The house went on the market shortly after Dad made his decision. Watching strangers walk through it during open houses was bittersweet. Every inch of that house was filled with memories, both good and bad. Part of me wanted to fight to keep it, but deep down, I knew that wasn't realistic. Selling it was the clearest way to move forward. The sale went unexpectedly fast. Within 2 weeks, we received an offer well above the asking price. Dad was ecstatic, and even Nick couldn't argue with the financial benefit. Once the sale closed, the proceeds were split evenly between Nick and me, just as promised. When the money hit my account, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't just about the money. It marked the end of an era, but it also gave me a fresh start, and I was determined to make the most of it. With my share of the inheritance, I finally had the financial freedom to start rebuilding my life. I moved into a beautiful new apartment, upgraded my home office, and even took a few weeks off to travel, a luxury I hadn't had in years. I also started therapy, which has been incredibly helpful. For so long, I'd been carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations and guilt. Learning to put myself first hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. As for Dad, he seems to be adjusting to life with Nick, although I can tell he misses the quieter, more structured routine we had. He's called me a few times to chat and even apologized again for how things played out. I don't think he fully understands the depth of the hurt, but I appreciate the effort. As for Nick, we're still not speaking. And honestly, that's fine with me. I've spent too much of my life trying to please him, and I'm not doing that anymore. If he wants to stay mad, that's his choice. This whole experience has been a roller coaster, but it's taught me some important lessons. I've learned that it's okay to stand up for myself, even if it makes others uncomfortable. I've learned that family doesn't always mean fairness, and that's okay. Most importantly, I've learned that I deserve to put myself first sometimes. To anyone else dealing with family drama, just know you're not alone. It's hard, it's messy, but you have the right to fight for what's fair, and sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and focus on your own happiness. Hey everyone, let's take a moment to reflect on Opie's powerful story. A tale of sacrifice, betrayal, and ultimately, empowerment. For years, Opie gave everything to care for their aging father, their time, career, and even personal happiness. But when their father decided to move in with a brother who barely helped and planned to give him the entire inheritance, Opie faced a heart-wrenching decision: fight for fairness or walk away. This story resonates with so many of us who have felt underappreciated in family dynamics. It highlights the emotional toll of caregiving, the injustice of being sidelined after making sacrifices, and the deep wounds that can form when loved ones don't acknowledge your worth. But it's not just a story of pain. It's a story of growth. Opie stood up for themselves, even when it meant confronting their father and brother in ways they never had before. With the support of a strong ally, shout out to Aunt Laura, they reclaimed their voice and fought for the fairness they deserved. So, what can you take from this? Speak up for yourself. Fairness isn't selfish, it's necessary. Don't let guilt define you. Your sacrifices deserve recognition. Choose yourself. Opie's decision to walk away from toxic dynamics and focus on their own happiness is a reminder that sometimes the best thing you can do is prioritize your own well-being. If you've ever been in a similar situation, know that you're not alone. This story is a call to action for anyone who feels undervalued by their family or taken for granted in relationships. You deserve fairness, you deserve respect, and you deserve to live a life where your sacrifices are acknowledged and celebrated. Let's talk about it. What would you have done in Opie's shoes? How do you handle family drama when the stakes are high? Share your thoughts, experiences, or even just words of encouragement for anyone facing similar struggles. Let's support each other and remind ourselves that standing up for what's right is always worth it.